The air in the 12th century Irish village hung thick with dread, reeking of wet earth and burnt herbs as shadows clawed at the flickering torchlight. A young girl writhed on the stone floor of the chapel, her voice a guttural snarl that echoed in the vaulted silence. "He belongs to us." Archbishop Malachy, his face gaunt yet luminous with resolve, pressed a weathered crucifix to her forehead. The villagers recoiled as her body arched unnaturally, a chorus of whispers swelling into screams. Then a shaft of light, golden, blinding, sliced through the chapel's gloom. The girl fell still. When her eyes fluttered open, clear and human, the crowd erupted into sobs of awe. Malachy slumped, spent, murmuring, "God's mercy is the only exorcism." But history, like faith, is written by the victors. By 1139, the Vatican seal clamped shut on records of this night, burying the miracle beneath layers of vellum and denial. Why silence a saint? Because saints who channel divine power outside Rome's iron grip are dangerous. Malachy's healings and exorcisms weren't just acts of piety, they were rebellions. Each cured leper, each liberated soul whispered a truth the Church feared, that holiness could bloom wild, untamed by papal decrees. Centuries later, the echoes of that night linger like a curse. The village's name vanished from maps, its chapel reduced to lichen-stained rubble. Yet locals still speak of the night the devil wept, their voices dropping as though the Vatican's shadow stretches across time. What did Malachy unleash? In that chapel, modern scholars dismiss it as mass hysteria, a medieval fever dream. But fragments of parchment hidden in Dublin's archives tell another story, of a forbidden prayer Malachy inscribed in blood, of a light so pure it scorched the eyes of witnesses. The Church's silence wasn't mere bureaucracy, it was fear. Fear of a man who wielded miracles like a sword, who answered not to cardinals but to the divine. Fear that his legacy might expose the rot festering beneath Rome's gilded facade. Yet some truths refused to stay entombed. In 2023, a storm-battered journal surfaced in a Dublin flea market, its pages crammed with 12th century Latin and sketches of a radiant figure. Malachy, haloed not by gold leaf, but by flames. Between the lines, a pattern emerges. Villages healed, demons named aloud, a trail of light leading to Rome's doorstep, but the final entry ends mid-sentence, ink pooled like blood. They come for him tonight. The rest is ash. Malachy's story is a ghost, haunting the edges of faith and power. Was he a martyr, a mystic, or a threat? The answer lies in the unquiet dark, where miracles and conspiracies share the same breath. Listen closely. Can you hear it? The rustle of parchment, the echo of a prayer, the Vatican's lock trembling on its hinge. Dublin's National Library smelled of dust and damp parchment, a tomb of forgotten histories where Clara Byrne now lurked, her career in ruins. Disgraced after a fabricated scandal gutted her reputation, she'd become a ghost in her own life, until the day her trembling fingers brushed a crumbling manuscript tucked behind a false panel in the theology section. Its leather binding crackled like a corpse's skin, and the Latin scrawl inside bore a single name, repeated like an incantation. Malachy. The pages hissed with secrets, accounts of withered limbs restored, of a blind nun who saw visions of heaven after his touch, of a boy who spoke in tongues, silenced by the saint's whispered prayer. But it was the marginalia that chilled her. Suppressio veritatis, suppression of the truth, stamped in faded Vatican red. Clara's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a relic, it was a crime scene. 8 centuries earlier, a boy named Malachy O'Morgair knelt in the mud of Armagh, his hands raw from scrubbing monastery floors. The other novices mocked his peasant brogue, but he'd long since traded pride for penance, until the night the dream came, a voice like molten iron. You will be a light in the darkness." He woke screaming, his palms seared with blisters, in the shape of crosses. The abbot dismissed it as fever delirium, but Malachy knew God had marked him. Clara, poring over the manuscript under a flickering desk lamp, felt a strange kinship with that boy. Both outcasts, both haunted by a truth too bright to ignore. The manuscript's final page held a sketch, a skeletal figure in bishop's robes, standing atop a mountain of writhing bodies. Beneath it, a phrase: "Lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae eam non, li comprehenderunt." The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. But someone had tried. Clara cross-referenced dates. Malachy's miracles peaked in 1138, then vanished from records, coinciding with his summons to Rome. The Church hadn't just erased him, they'd rewritten him, pruning his sainthood into a safe, skeletal myth. Why? She leaned closer, the lamplight throwing her shadow like a noose on the wall. Then the lights died. The library plunged into blackness. Clara froze, the manuscript's parchment suddenly icy against her skin. A draught snaked through the room, carrying the faintest whisper. Latin. Not the sterile Vatican dialect, but guttural, ancient. "In nomine diaboli." Her phone buzzed, shattering the silence. An email from an untraceable address. "Stop digging." Attached was a photo of her apartment door, taken hours earlier. The threat was clear, but so was the desperation behind it. They were afraid of what she'd uncovered, or who. In the shadows, history bled into the present. Malachy's light had been a threat to the medieval church's rigid hierarchy, just as Clara's discovery menaced its modern gatekeepers. Saints, she realized, are not born. They are manufactured. Martyrs are curated, miracles sanitized. Malachy's sin wasn't heresy. It was autonomy. He healed without permission, exorcised without ritual, answered to a authority higher than cardinals. To resurrect his story was to expose the rot still clinging to the Vatican's foundations, the lie that faith must be funneled through bureaucracy. Clara fled the library, the manuscript hidden beneath her coat. Rain lashed the streets, turning Dublin into a blur of neon and shadows. In a dim pub, she spread the pages on a sticky table. The sketch of the skeletal bishop now seemed to pulse, the inked bodies twisting as she tilted the parchment. A hidden message? She dripped condensation from her glass onto the corner, a trick she'd learned as an investigative reporter. Slowly, brown letters surfaced, clavis in cord Hiberniae. The key lies in Ireland's heart. A coordinates? A metaphor? The pub's TV flickered overhead, a news ticker blaring, "Vatican dismisses conspiracy theories about secret archives." Her laptop dinged. Another email. No words this time, just an audio file. Static hissed, then a voice, rasping and hollow. "He warned us. The light burns those who touch it." A scream ruptured the recording, cut abruptly to silence. Clara slammed the laptop shut. Across the room, a man in a black overcoat watched her, his face obscured by a hat. When she looked again, he was gone, but a single rose lay on the empty seat, its petals edged in crimson. Malachy's first vision had been a calling. Clara's was a warning. The church's ghosts were awake, and they'd tasted her fear. Yet in the manuscript's margins, she found a faded note, likely from the monk who'd risked his life to hide it. Veritas numquam perit. Truth never dies. She traced the words, her breath fogging the rain-streaked window. Somewhere in the storm-lashed hills of Ireland, a key waited, a truth that could vindicate Malachy or bury her. The clock ticked, the lights flickered, and in the darkness the past whispered back. The Irish court of 1127 stank of decay. King Cormac III, once a bull of a man, lay skeletal beneath ermine furs, his breath rattling like pebbles in a tin cup. Plague had gnawed his flesh to parchment, and physicians muttered of God's judgment for his war against the church. But in the shadows, a young monk waited, Malachy, barely 20, his hands calloused from digging graves. The bishops had barred him from the king's chamber, fearing his unseemly methods. Yet when Cormac's death rattle echoed through the castle, Malachy burst in, clutching a vial of holy water so old it glowed faintly in the dark. "Not yet," he hissed, not to the king, but to the air itself. He pressed his palm to Cormac's fevered brow and prayed, not in Latin but in guttural Old Irish, the language of hedgerow witches and druid. The bishops recoiled as the king's body arched, black bile spewing from his lips. Then silence. Cormac's eyes fluttered open, clear as a summer stream. By dawn, he ate venison with his bare hands. Malachy vanished before the court could crown him a hero, leaving only a scorch mark on the stone floor, a shape too precise to be flame. Centuries later, in a fluorescent-lit university office, Clara Byrne faced a different kind of plague, institutional scorn. Dr. Eamon Quinn, a historian with a smirk sharp enough to flay saints, tossed her manuscript photocopies onto his desk. "Folklore," he sneered. Malachy's miracles were political theatre. Cormac recovered because his physicians stopped bleeding him with leeches, not prayers. Clara's jaw tightened. She'd heard the same dismissive tone when her reporting on church corruption was discredited 3 years prior. But as she left, a leather-bound ledger in the university's rare books collection caught her eye. Royal Household Expenditures, 1125, 1130, qua. Dust motes swirled as she flipped to 1127. Payment to Brother Malachy O'Morgair, 6 silver pennies for the restoration of the king's health. The entry was blotted out centuries later, the ink replaced with Deo gratias. Thanks be to God. But the indentations lingered, ghostly and undeniable. The clatter of Clara's typewriter that night was a staccato counterpoint to the Celtic harp melody drifting from her laptop, a recording Quinn had played to mock her. "Listen to that," he'd jeered. "Pretty lies." But now, as she transcribed the ledger's damning evidence, the harp's strings snapped one by one in the recording, each break punctuated by a dissonant shriek. Malachy's defiance, it seemed, still grated on modern ears. The church hadn't just erased his miracle, they'd weaponized time itself, spinning history into a noose for truth-tellers. Clara's cursor blinked over a sentence. "Why does a saint need a receipt?" Because sainthood, she realized, is a contract. Sign in blood, obey the terms, and Rome builds you a stained-glass cage. Malachy refused to sign. In the 12th century, his reward was exile. Cormac's recovery destabilized the bishop's stranglehold on royal power, proving divine favor could flow outside their coffers. Malachy's methods, raw, intuitive, alive, terrified them. He hadn't just healed a king. He'd exposed the rot festering beneath the church's guilt. Clara's fingers froze over her keyboard. The ledger's Deo gratias overlay wasn't medieval. It matched ink samples from 19th century Vatican. Revisions. They'd scrubbed Malachy's payment, yes, but left the original indentations as if taunting future seekers. "Here's the truth. Dare you dig it up?" Rain lashed Clara's apartment windows as she cross-referenced the ledger with Malachy's journal. A pattern emerged. Every miracle coincided with a political crisis. Cormac's healing came days before he defied Rome's tithe demands. A leper colony's cure aligned with a peasant revolt against monastic landlords. Malachy wasn't just a healer. He was a strategist, using miracles as munitions in a holy war. Clara's breath fogged the screen. The church hadn't silenced him for heresy, but for insurrection. Then the harp music stopped. Her laptop screen flickered, the audio file replaced by a pixelated image. A 12th century fresco from a forgotten chapel. Malachy stood beside Cormac, but the king's face was scratched out, replaced by a skeletal hand clutching a cross. Beneath it, a phrase, Qui solvit reges, ligabit vos. He who loosens kings will bind you. Clara's phone buzzed, an unknown number. Check your mail, read the text. A package waited downstairs, postmarked Vatican City. Inside lay a vellum fragment, a 19th century confessor's note. Burn the Cormac evidence. They know. The paper reeked of myrrh, a funeral scent. Malachy's ghost, it seemed, wasn't the only one restless. Clara stared at the ledger's ghostly indentation, now glowing faintly under UV light, a medieval watermark of crossed keys. The same keys stamped on the package's wax seal. The message was clear. Rome still guarded its secrets. But as she traced the scorch mark in the ledger's margin, a perfect match to Malachy's signature burn, the harp's final string twanged in the silence. Some bonds, she thought, can't hold. The clock struck 3 a.m. Somewhere, in a vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a file shifted in the dark. And in Dublin, a disgraced journalist and a dead saint forged a pact across the centuries, united by a truth that refused to rot. The walls of Armagh Cathedral wept in 1134. Not with holy water, but with a thick, oily residue that pooled in the grooves of saints' effigies, their stone eyes rolling skyward as if begging deliverance. The air throbbed with a low, guttural chant. No human tongue could shape those syllables, as shadows slithered along the nave, coalescing into shapes with too many limbs. Malachy stood alone at the altar, his stole torn, his voice raw from days of failed rites. The bishops had fled, clutching their crucifixes like talismans. Only his scribe, Brother Tadg, remained, quill trembling over parchment as he documented the horror. The demon mocks the litany. It speaks through the statues. Malachy knew the church's sanctioned exorcisms were useless here. This was no ordinary possession. The cathedral itself was infected, its sanctity inverted. Reaching into his robes, he drew a scroll sealed. With his own blood, a prayer transcribed from his childhood vision, one Rome had forbidden him to utter. Deus ignis contere umbras, he began, and the ground quaked. Tadg's inkwell exploded, black tendrils snaking up his arms as the walls cracked open, vomiting a swarm of winged things. Malachy roared the prayer's final line, and light erupted from his mouth, incinerating the creatures mid-flight. When dawn broke, the cathedral stood cleansed, its stones bleached bone-white. But Tadg's parchment bore a final frantic note. He has damned himself to save us. 8 centuries later, Clara Byrne knelt in a Belfast attic, the floorboards groaning under her weight as she pried open a rusted strongbox. Inside lay a diary bound in what looked like human skin, the last relic of Malachy's scribe, passed down through Tadg's descendants. The current heir, a chain-smoking nun named Sister Maeve, hovered in the doorway, her rosary beads clacking like teeth. "Burn it," she hissed. "That book's a curse." Clara ignored her, gloves trembling as she deciphered Tadg's coded script. The entries detailed Malachy's exile from Armagh, not for heresy, but for efficiency. His forbidden prayer worked too well, too fast, bypassing the church's drawn-out exorcism rituals. Rome accused him of reckless mysticism, fearing his power would render their rites obsolete, but Tadg's final page chilled her. A sketch of Malachy's face, eyes hollowed out, replaced by twin flames. Beneath it, "The light eats him from within." Clara's phone buzzed. A notification for a New York Times article. Vatican revises exorcism guidelines amid rising demonic cases. Coincidence? She scanned the diary again. Malachy's prayer wasn't just a spiritual weapon. It was a pattern, a frequency that destabilized entities. Modern physics jargon. But Tadg described the aftermath identically. The air hummed for days, like a plucked string. Clara's fingers flew over her laptop, cross-referencing the prayer's cadence with electromagnetic wave models. A match. Malachy hadn't been exorcising demons, he'd been disrupting them. Rain hammered the attic's slanted roof as Sister Maeve finally snapped, snatching the diary. "You think you're the first to chase his ghost?" She ripped, a page free revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, a vial of ash and a 1943 letter from Maeve's grandfather, a priest who tried to replicate Malachy's prayer during a World War II exorcism. "It worked," he wrote, "but the demon, it didn't leave. It shattered, and the pieces, they entered us." The letter ended mid-sentence, ink blotted with brown stains. Maeve's voice dropped. He carved his eyes out, said the light was crawling inside him. Clara's breath fogged the air. The attic's single. Bulb flickered, casting her shadow on the wall, a distorted silhouette with too many joints. "Not my shadow." She spun, but the room was empty. Maeve made the sign of the cross. "They're here. They've been waiting for someone brave enough to speak the prayer." Outside, thunder cracked like a whip, and Clara's laptop screen flared to life, displaying a live feed of Armagh Cathedral, its walls weeping black sludge. Malachy's sin was never rebellion. It was clarity. He saw the church's exorcisms for what they were, theatre designed to prolong dependency on priestly intermediaries. His prayer cut the strings, offering direct communion with the divine, a threat to Rome's monopoly on salvation. Clara understood now. The Vatican's modern revisions weren't progress. They were a return to the old script. Keep the rites convoluted. Keep the people afraid. As Clara fled Belfast with the diary, her train rattling through the night, she opened Tadg's final entry. A lock of hair fell out, white as bone, tied with a scarlet thread. Malachys. The words blurred as she read. "He warned me. The prayer is alive. It chooses who wields it." Outside her window, the countryside blurred into a smear of shadows, or were they moving? Closer. Hungrier. She thumbed the vial of ash, its grains unnaturally warm. In the reflection, her eyes flickered, gold, just for a heartbeat. Malachys. Light had a cost. It demanded surrender, a dissolution of the self. Clara's hands shook, but she typed anyway, uploading Tadg's diary to the cloud. "Let the world see. Let the Vatican burn." As the train plunged into a tunnel, she whispered the first line of the forbidden prayer, Deus Ignis, and her phone exploded in a burst of static. When light returned, the diary was gone, but on her palms, blisters bloomed in the shape of crosses. Rome's emissaries arrived in winter, their black cloaks crusted with alpine snow, their breath frosting the air like curses. Malachy received them in a bare stone cell, his hands still stained with the ash of a healed leper's pyre. Cardinal Vitale, a man whose face resembled a tombstone, unrolled a papal bull with a snap. "Cease these theatrics," he hissed. "Miracles require permission." Malachy's crime was not heresy, but competition. Each unsanctioned healing eroded the Vatican's monopoly on divine favor. When he refused, Vitale placed a leaden seal on the table, its edges sharp enough to draw blood. "The next miracle you perform will be your last." But Malachy had already turned away, his shadow thrown large on the wall by the firelight, a silhouette crowned with flickering horns. "Tell Rome," he said softly, "even shadows fear the light." In Clara Byrne's Dublin apartment, the shadows were closing in. She returned from a midnight coffee run to find her door ajar, the deadbolt sheared clean, a surgical cut, no splinters. Inside, chaos reigned, books gutted, hard drives gone, the air reeking of frankincense. They'd taken Tadg's diary. But Clara's hands flew to her throat, where she'd hidden the vial of ash on a chain. Still there. Cold. Too cold. She collapsed at her desk, only to freeze. A single page remained on the floor, torn from the diary. A sketch of Malachy's silhouette, horns and all, identical to the shadow he'd cast for Vitale. Scrawled beneath it, "Non est potestas nisi a Deo." No power except from God. But someone had added a modern postscript in red ink. "Tell Clara, stop playing saint." The church's fingerprints were everywhere, yet nowhere. No cameras caught the intruders. No neighbors heard a sound. Only the faintest echo lingered, a Latin chant, Dies irae, dies illa, drifting from her shattered bathroom mirror. Clara knew the game. The Vatican had spent centuries perfecting the art of erasure. In Malachy's day, they sent assassins with poisoned communion wine. Today, they used lawyers, hackers, and the quiet violence of bureaucracy. But as she studied the diary's surviving page under UV light, a hidden pattern emerged. Malachy's shadow wasn't a trick of the fire. It was a map, its horned curves tracing the coastline of Lough Derg, site of his final forbidden pilgrimage. A knock startled her. Father Aloysius, a defrocked priest turned street preacher, stood in the hall, his eyes darting like sparrows. "They still don't want this truth out," he whispered, pressing a USB drive into her palm. "But there's rot in the roots, always has been." The drive contained scans of 19th century Vatican payrolls, payments to revisionist scribes tasked with scrubbing Malachy's miracles from chronicles. One entry chilled her. Disposal of remains from Armagh Cathedral renovation, 1842. Bones burned. A footnote. Testa fracta. Skull fractured. Malachys. Clara's fingers tightened around the vial. His ash. The past bled into the present. In 1139, Malachy defied Rome by curing a village of heretics, excommunicated for questioning papal infallibility. The Vatican's response? Declare the plague divine punishment and bar all priests from entering the town. Malachy went anyway, his prayers delivered not from a pulpit but a hay cart. Clara, scrolling through the USB files, found a match. A 12th century fresco hidden beneath a Florentine church. Malachy, painted among the heretics, his face scored out by later hands. But the artist had left a clue. The hay cart's wheel bore the same horned shadow from the diary. A signature, a middle finger to Rome. Midnight chimed. Clara's laptop died mid-sentence, the screen reflecting movement behind her. A figure in a cardinal's cassock, face blurred. She spun, but the room was empty. Only the USB drive remained, now warm to the touch. When she reinserted it, a sigh, new file appeared, audio of a guttural voice reciting Malachy's forbidden prayer. Deus ignis. The walls trembled. Plaster dust rained down as the chant swelled, voices overlapping, centuries of whispers trapped in the Vatican's vaults. Clara's vision doubled. For a heartbeat she saw Malachy in his cell, staring at the papal seal, and her own reflection. In the dark window, a horned shadow stretching across Dublin. The chant ended with a scream, modern, familiar. Her own voice, recorded during the break-in. The message was clear. Rome wasn't just watching. It was inside her walls, her tech, her mind. Yet as Clara played the corrupted audio backward, a phrase emerged. In Lough Derg, the shadow becomes the man. Somewhere, a bell tolled. Malachy's ash burned against her skin. And in the silence between seconds, the whisper returned. Dies. Ire. Now a taunt, now a plea. Judgment Day was coming. For whom? Even the shadows couldn't say. The village of Kells lay shrouded in pestilence, its cottages choked with the stench of rotting flesh and despair. Malachy, gaunt and feverish, moved through the dying like a wraith, his hands trembling as he pressed them to blistered skin. He'd already coughed blood into his sleeve. They'd gotten to him first. But the plague's grip broke beneath his touch, villagers rising gasping from their deathbeds. By dawn, Kells breathed again. But as Malachy staggered toward Rome, summoned by a papal decree he distrusted, his veins burned as if filled with molten lead. A peasant boy trailing his caravan swore he saw a hooded figure slip a powder into the saint's wine. By nightfall, Malachy collapsed in a ditch, his final journal entry scrawled in bile-dark ink, "I serve God, not men." The Vatican declared it a fever. The dirt under his nails, stained with a metallic sheen, suggested otherwise. 8 centuries later, Clara Byrne's flashlight beam cut through the gloom of a sealed Vatican sub-archive, her gloves gritty with the dust of censored lives. Between ledgers detailing medieval tithes, she found a lead vial labeled Toxicum, its wax seal intact, its contents a crystalline powder that glinted like crushed stars. Lab reports would later confirm arsenic, but Clara already knew. She'd read Malachy's symptoms, the burning veins, the blackened tongue, the way his corpse reportedly smoldered for days, resisting decay. The vial's provenance was a slap. Property of the Office of Papal Sanctity, 1138. The Church hadn't just killed him. They'd curated his death, preserving the murder weapon like a relic. In the archive's silence, Clara's breath fogged the air. Malachy's journal entry glowed on her phone, its defiance a mirror. "I serve God, not men." But the vial whispered a darker truth. Sainthood is a puppet show, and the strings lead back to Rome. As she pocketed the poison, a cold draught snuffed her flashlight. Somewhere in the dark, parchment rustled, a sound like laughter or a dying man's gasp. Malachy's ghost wasn't resting, it was waiting. The Vatican's canonization hall in 1190 was a theater of cold marble and colder politics. Malachy's corpse had molded for 50 years, but his legacy still reeked of rebellion. Cardinals in scarlet robes circled his sealed hagiography like vultures, quills poised to excise the miracles that threatened their narrative. Healed a king, too empowering for the masses. Defeated a cathedral's infestation with a forbidden prayer. A blueprint for insurrection. When the vote came, the yes ballots outnumbered the no. But the final decree was a skeleton, a St. Hollowed of his fire. The official record glowed with vague acts of piety, while the truth festered in cipher-locked ledgers. Malachys rebellis, sed utilum. Malachy the rebel, but useful. Sainthood, Rome proved, is not a crown, it's a cage. Clara Byrne felt the weight of that cage as she hunched over a microfilm reader in a Jesuit archive. The whir of the machine syncopated with her furious typing. The document on screen, a 12th century canonization ledger, was a masterpiece of omission. Malachy's miracles were reduced to footnotes, his exorcisms labeled spiritual fervor, but in the margins, a bored scribe had doodled a horned shadow beside his name, its ink faded to ghost blue. Clara's phone buzzed. A encrypted audio file from her Vatican contact, a Monsignor whose voice trembled with decades of swallowed secrets. "You think saints are chosen by God. They're chosen by committees. Holiness is a PR campaign, always has been." Behind him, echoing footsteps crescendoed, someone approaching. The line died with a click. The sound design of Clara's unraveling was a symphony of dissonance. Her keystrokes, sharp, relentless, clashed against the Gregorian chant, drifting from her laptop, while the archive's silence thickened into something predatory. She cross-referenced the ledger with a digitized fragment of Malachy's diary, recovered from a Venetian palazzo's secret library. The match was grotesque. Rome had canonized him not for his miracles, but despite them. A 1190 memo buried in the archives laid it bare. Better to sanctify the man than let rebels sanctify his cause. Clara's breath hitched. Malachys. Sainthood wasn't vindication, it was containment. A way to neuter his legacy, repackage him as a meek servant rather than a divine insurgent. In the shadows of St. Peter's, history repeated. A junior archivist, sweating under his cassock, slid Clara a USB drive during a midnight mass. Its contents, photos of a 15th century fresco recently uncovered beneath the Vatican gardens. Malachy, haloed and chained, offering a scroll to a peasant. Mob. The fresco's paint was laced with crushed malachite, a mineral that glowed under UV light. When Clara scanned it, hidden text flared, potestas non est veritas. Power is not truth. The church had buried it, just as they'd buried the vial of Toxicum, just as they'd bury Clara if she blinked. But Malachy's ghost was a collaborator. In the archive's deepest vault, Clara found a 13th century confessor's manual, its pages reeking of myrrh. A chapter on recalcitrant saints detailed how to purify their cults, destroy relics, redirect pilgrimages, co-opt their feast days. The author, the same cardinal who'd canonized Malachy. Clara's laughter was a dry, cracked thing. All these centuries, and the playbook hasn't changed. Modernize the language, swap quills for algorithms, and the Vatican's machinery of control still hummed, censoring miracles, shadow-banning dissent, using sainthood to sanitize the past. As dawn bled through the archive's stained glass, Clara's cursor hovered over the publish button. Her article exposed it all. The redacted miracles, the poisoned saint, the fresco's silent scream, but her screen flickered, a hacked alert. You're good, Clara. But he was better. Look what it cost him. Attached was a scan of Malachy's death mask, his lips sewn shut with golden thread. A final threat or a plea? Outside, the footsteps returned, louder now, syncopated with her pulse. She hit send. Let them come. The podcast episode would end with a fade to silence, then the creak of a vault door opening, a sound pulled from Vatican security tapes. But in that silence, sharp-eared listeners would catch it, a whisper, half Latin, half static, threading through the dead air. Potestas non est veritas. A truth or a curse. For Clara, typing faster now, it was both. The shrine was a skeletal thing, crumbling stone veiled in ivy, its cross splintered by centuries of storms, yet the air around it hummed. Awif, age 9, terminal diagnosis etched into her medical charts like a death warrant, had been drawn here by a dream. A man with fire in his palms, whispering, "Tell them I'm still here." Her parents, desperate as only the damned can be, carried her to the ruins at twilight. She knelt, her small frame swallowed by the overgrown archway, and pressed a hand to the relic's moss-caked base. The dusk deepened. Then, a sound, like a breath held too long finally released, rippled through the field. A weaver stood, her pallor replaced by a flush of rose, and declared, "He fixed me." By dawn, scans showed her tumors vanished, her blood pristine. The miracle, raw and untamed, blazed across social media before the Vatican could smother it. Malachy's name trended, not as a footnote in hagiographies, but as a hashtag. The real saint. Clara Byrne watched the digital storm from a dim cafe, her laptop screen casting a blue pallor over the vial of Toxicum beside her coffee. A whiff's recovery wasn't just a medical anomaly, it was a theological grenade. The girl had bypassed priests, sacraments, the entire ecclesiastical machine, just as Malachy had. Clara's exposé, uploaded minutes after the news broke, detonated the Vatican's facade. Lab reports confirming the poison, Tudg's diary scans revealing the cover-up, the horned shadow fresco, All of it viral now, pixels and parchment colliding in a digital uprising. The church's denials crumbled like aged mortar. A spokesman stammered about ongoing investigations, but the world had seen the cracks. Holiness, it seemed, could still erupt like wildfire. In Rome, the archives trembled. A Monsignor, face obscured by shadows, leaked a 17th-century directive. Any veneration of Malachy's unsanctioned miracles must be met with silentium et securitas, silence and suppression. The document trended beside selfies of pilgrims, flocking to the shrine, their candles piercing the County Cork gloom. A waif, now a reluctant icon, appeared on talk shows, clutching a stuffed owl and repeating, "The fireman told me not to be scared." The Vatican's lawyers mobilized, threatening lawsuits, but their edicts drowned in a tide of hashtags and TikTok hymns. Malachy's prayer, once forbidden, now echoed in viral chants, teenagers reciting Deus Ignis over synth beats. Clara, tracking the frenzy, unearthed a darker thread. Our waif's healing bore the same signature as Malachy's miracles: instantaneous, visceral, unapproved. The church's medieval playbook resurfaced. Discredit the girl, buy off her parents, dispatch experts to attribute her cure to spontaneous remission. But this time, the strategy faltered. A live-streamed press conference backfired when Oif's father, a burly fisherman, slammed a fist on the podium. "You're not taking her truth too." The clip looped on news channels, a modern-day David roaring at Goliath. Yet shadows lingered. Clara's inbox flooded with threats, some laced with medieval Latin, others with IP addresses tracing to Vatican City. A midnight call breathed. He couldn't save himself. What makes you think he'll save you? But in the cafe's flickering light, she grinned. The relic hunters were already scouring Europe for Malachy's lost artifacts. A podcaster in Madrid claimed to have found his crucifix, its chain fused to a scorched rib bone. Conspiracy forums lit up with theories. The Vatican's secret exorcism squads, a Malachy code hidden in cathedral frescoes. The truth, once buried, now mutated, thrived, evolved. As Clara shut her laptop, the vial of ash warmed against her wrist. Malachy's remains, or so she believed. Outside, rain sheeted the streets, but the shrine in Cork glowed, a beacon for the faithful and the furious. The church, cornered, announced a re-examination of Malachy's sainthood. A hollow victory, but Clara knew. Revolutions begin with cracks, not crumbles. The episode would close on audio from Oif's shrine, wind whistling through stone, a child's laughter, then a whisper not quite human. Lux in tenebris. Fade to static. Narration. Sometimes the truth won't stay buried. Sometimes it rises, not with a shovel, but a wildfire. The Vatican's amendment arrived not with fanfare, but a whisper, a single line buried in the digital recesses of the Acta Sanctorum, Miracula Malachii Confirmata. Malachy's miracles, once purged, now stood ratified in sterile Latin. No press conference, no penitent pope, just the creak of a ledger closing, as if 7 centuries of lies could be sealed with bureaucratic ink. But in Dublin, Clara Byrne framed the email notification and hung it beside her resurrected byline, investigative journalist, truth seeker. Her apartment, once a crime scene of stolen diaries and threats, now hummed with the clatter of her keyboard. She'd traded viral fame for deeper work. A book, The Unbound Saint, its chapters etched with the names of modern Malachys, whistleblowers, mystics, the quiet rebels who lit matches in the Vatican's velvet dark. In 1139, Malachy died choking on his own blood. In 2023, his prayer echoed through Armagh Cathedral for the first time. The Archbishop, pressured by pilgrims camped on the lawn, had relented, as the choir intoned, Deus Ignis. Sunlight, fractured through stained glass, casting the horned shadow from Tadish's diary onto the altar. A nun fainted. A child laughed. The bishop's face tightened, but the words were loose now, alive, a virus of grace. Some claimed the air warmed. Others swore they heard a sigh, ancient, unburdened. Clara stood at the cathedral's rear, clutching. The vial of ash, it pulsed faintly, a relic or a placebo, she no longer cared. The truth was enough. Her phone buzzed, a photo from Oif's parents, the girl racing through autumn leaves, tumor-free. "Miracles endure," she texted back, but in the Vatican's secret archives, a clerk stamped a new file. Clara Byrne, monitor, not engage. Saints, like stories, were never truly safe. Legends fade, but miracles endure. Not because they defy reason, but because they defy silence. Malachy's light was buried, Clara's nearly snuffed, but fire lingers in ash. So listen. The next time you hear a whisper from the dark, a story that chills and compels, remember, truth is not a blade, it's a spark.